Hey everyone, and welcome to your Java tutorial on functions. So to begin, let's delete our hello world example here, and let's define what is a function. So a function is a set of instructions bundled together to achieve a specific outcome. So a function is basically, it's also reusable, right? So a function, maybe we could say a reusable set of instructions bundled together to achieve a specific outcome. And so there's a distinction here between a function and a method, right? So a function is sort of a standalone set of instructions that are bundled together, whereas a method is a function, but it's part of a class, right? So this is sort of our basic definition for what a function is. Now, Java is sort of a very heavily object-reliant programming language. So as you can see, our main method here is inside of a class already called our app class here. So all of the functions that we're going to be writing in this tutorial are technically methods of the app class. And we can get around it and stuff like that. But I think that right now, for what we're trying to cover, this distinction is not super important. But it's just a good thing to have in mind. So another thing I wanted to point out before we dig into the sort of syntax of a function is this static keyword, right? So we're going to be using this function directly in our main method, which is where our program begins. Our main method is static. And so I don't want to cover this too early on, but we're kind of a little bit forced to here. Static methods and static variables, and that is variables and methods that use this static keyword, they exist on the level of the class versus the level of the object. And we're going to get into this more, actually, I think next week when we talk about classes. But right now, all you need to know is that if a method uses the static keyword, if you want to invoke a method inside of a static method, that method also has to be static. So for this tutorial, we're going to be using static methods. Once we get into classes and objects, then I'll show you how to use just a regular method. Okay, so enough preface here. Let's get into how to create a function in Java. So I'm going to create this outside of our main method here, as we discussed, and I am going to start with our static keyword. And again, this is how to create a static method. It's different than how to create a normal method, but we're going to get into that in next week. It's a method because it's inside of this app class. Otherwise, if it's outside of it, in other languages, this is easier, like C++. You can create functions outside of any method, and they just kind of exist in the ether. In that case, those are true functions. This is a method, so you might hear me use those terms interchangeably. So I know I said no more talking and then talked a bunch, but let's begin with a function. Really, outside of the static keyword, a function is going to begin with the return type. Right. So for this function, and return types can be integers, strings, any type of type. A class that you create yourself, that defines a type, so it could be anything. For this, we're going to be returning nothing. So I will start out with a void type. Void basically means we're going to return nothing. It indicates that don't expect any return value from this function. After we have the return type, we are then going to need a human readable name. That's the function name. And we're going to call this greeting. And then we're going to have some open and close parentheses. And that open and close parentheses gives the user the opportunity to pass in a parameter. And functions in Java can take, no parameters or many parameters. Then after the opportunity to pass in the parameters is given, we do an open and close curly brace, and this creates the scope of our function. And inside of this scope is where we put our instructions. So, all right, I'll do a close curly brace there. So your instructions go here. So I'll put, at the end of this, I'll put instructions. That's your basic syntax for a function. What I'm going to do is for this function, we're just going to print out hello world, which is something we should be familiar with because we start off with this instruction at the beginning of pretty much every tutorial. And there you go. That's how you create your first function. So now let's get into how to invoke a function, right? So this is the function declaration. So I'll label that here. We'll do function declaration. We have our function definition above, and let's create our function invocation here, right? To invoke a function in Java, all you have to do is just call it by its name. So we can say greeting, and there you have it. It's as simple as that. So let's run this program, and we have down here hello world, which is our function's one instruction there. Perfect. So this is a very stripped down function. It's a void return type and a no parameters. So let's try another function that will say returns a string, and it will take in a integer. And we will call this lucky number. And we have an error here because it's saying method must return a result of type string. Perfect. So what that's indicating is that we don't return a string here. You can see we have written a string, but that's not, significant. So it's not returned. So to return a value in a function in Java, all you have to do is use the return keyword. And if we wanted to, we could just return an empty string, and that would satisfy the program. However, we're going to want to do something meaningful here. So let's access the string class. We will do a value of integer, and we'll pass in lucky number. So what this is doing, this is actually using another static function here. What this is doing is it's taking in our lucky number and converting it to a string. So in our program, I'm going to print out, I'm going to say your lucky number is, and then we will call greeting. And what we'll do first, for now, since it's just an example, I'm going to pass in the number 5, just hard code of 5 there, just for the sake of the example. You could also take in an input, put that into a variable, and pass that variable in. But for the sake of simplicity here, I'm just going to pass in a 5. We'll run this program, and we see your lucky number is 5, right? So here is the function invocation that's happening here. It's returning a string value of our whatever lucky number we pass in. This string here is the equivalent of if I was to create a string variable called lucky num, and I could set it equal to this function call here. And then I can pass in lucky num into our print statement here, run the code, and we see lucky number is 5. So it's the same thing. You can assign a variable to the result of a function call here because this function is producing a string value, right? So this function produces a string value, and that string value is assigned to the variable lucky num. And that works because it's a string type. So the compiler sees, oh, lucky num is going to be our human readable name. We need to set aside enough memory for a string. Perfect. And then greeting comes along and says, oh, you need a string. Here's the string output value of our function down here. And then we print it out to the console with this line. So that's sort of like a quick rundown of functions in Java. Functions are declared in a similar way to variables, except they take in a parameter here, and you write the instructions yourself on what the function needs to do. We covered static functions here. Like I said, static functions exist on the level of the class, not on the level of the object. We're going to get into the difference between static and regular, class versus object next week. But in Java in particular, it's difficult to cover functions without covering the static keyword because of the static nature of our main method. So this is your functions tutorial in Java. Thanks.